Hello, welcome back to the channel, and this is a channel where we give you reviews, playthroughs, unboxings. We generally like to talk a load of bollocks about tabletop gaming in general. And in this video we're going to be talking about an old school role-playing game. We're going to be talking about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition. This is a game that was released originally in 1977, written by Gary Gygax, and it took the world by storm, changing the face of gaming forever. In this video we're going to be giving you a very brief overview of the rules and a little bit of history as well. We're telling you what we do like, we don't like. Then we'll come back and we'll tell you whether or not 1st edition AD&D is still worth playing 40 odd years after it was first released in 1977. So remember, if you are new here, please consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment in that section down below. Hit the like button, all that shit. We'll see you after this. So, AD&D 1st edition. How'd you play this game? So, Dungeons & Dragons is a role-playing game that was first produced in 1973/1974. It was first released as a white box set, and in this box set you had 3 different volumes. You had Men and Magic, you had the Monsters and Treasures, and then you had a pamphlet which discussed Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. There were several supplements that were released at a later date, one of the most popular being the Dave Arneson Blackmore supplement. It was deities and demigods and stuff to do with eldritch magic and stuff like that, right? 1977, Gary Gygax took it upon himself to create AD&D. There's varying accounts of why he did this. Some people say it's to do with him trying to get the profits away from Dave Arneson. I don't know, don't care. But in 1977, the Monster Manual of the 1st edition AD&D was released. This was a tome of monsters, funnily enough, that you could use in your campaign to try and do over your players, right? Format for the Monster Manual was an A to Z of different creatures. You had all the different stats like the frequency, the armor class, the amount of hit dice, the alignment. You sometimes had a picture of these creatures, and then you had a block of text that would give you a brief description and tell you any sort of special traits or weapons or special abilities that these creatures might have had. A lot of these monsters that were included in the Monster Manual are derivatives of the classical Greek creatures and creatures that are lifted from folklore, but there are some original monsters in here as well. A lot of this is devoted to dragons and golems and demons. The demons were removed from the 2nd edition of AD&D due to what was known as the Satanic Panic in the 80s, where certain groups of people in the United States and Europe lobbied against Dungeons & Dragons and classed it as evil, made the headlines, but it didn't do anything. It only served to increase the popularity of D&D, and yeah, cheers for that. So the second volume that was released as the Player's Handbook. This is a book that tells you basically how to create your character. First stage of the book gives you different options on how to roll your dice. You could maybe just roll 3d6 and that would generate your stats like strength, constitution, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, charisma and all that sort of thing. Or maybe you could roll 4 dice and take the best 3. You'll also have a number of hit points. This is derived from hit dice. Each character has a number of hit dice they're going to roll depending on what level they are at, and that will tell you how hard your character is and how much damage it can withstand in a pub brawl. So once you've generated your stats, then you'll choose a character class and a race. A character class is essentially a job. You've got the basic classes like fighter, magic user, thief, cleric, and then you've got some sort of sub character classes like druid, monk, assassin, all that sort of stuff, right? Dependent on what stats you roll, you'll be able to choose a race. You can be human, dwarf, elf, halfling, and dependent on what race you end up with, there'll be a restriction on what level you can reach. Demi-humans generally can't advance as far as humans. This is something that was removed in later iterations of D&D, right? So once you have chosen your character class and your character's race, you'll then be given a bit of dosh so you can go down the shop and buy a load of weapons, right? Gary Gygax came from a wargaming background, so if you look at the equipment table, you'll see that there are a huge array of halberd, polearm type weapons that you can use, but it's all a bit weird really. So the book then goes on to describe all the different spells that the spellcasting classes can use. You're going to have these spells listed from level 1 to level 8, and the higher the level you are, the more powerful spells you can cast. So for example, a level 1 magic user spell may be read magic. This says by means of read magic spell, the magic user is able to read magical inscriptions on objects like books, scrolls and weapons and the like. Or you might have darkness. This says the spell causes total impenetrable darkness in the area of its effect. In contrast to this, when you have been playing for about a year, in Gygax's own words, you might be able to have a 9th level magic user spell. That is, if your magic user doesn't get killed when they only have a 1d4 of hit dice. You might choose the shape change spell, and it says with this spell, the magic user is able to assume the form of any creature of a demigod, greater devil, demon prince, singular dragon type, greater demon, and the like. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? You wouldn't want to be dying for a crab if you used the spell to turn into a dragon, would you? Or you might end up with the Trap the Soul spell. This spell is similar to the Magic Jar, except that the Trap the Soul spell forces the subject's creature's life force into a special prison magicked by the spellcaster. It's a bit like sitting in this fucking room, isn't it? So yeah, after you've chosen all your spells, this book will then go into a few different concepts like morale, and there's an appendix that goes on about psionics and all that. I don't think Gygax wanted to put that in there, but he was pressured to do it by his mate, so he put it in there anyway. There's some stuff about encumbrance, improvision and all that sort of stuff, but yeah, it's essentially just a guide on how to create your character and a big chunk of spells that you can choose, isn't it? The sort of third and final release in the core books was the Dungeon Master's Guide, right? This is a, well, for its time, it's quite a big time that it was released, and it gives you all the information that the DM needs to run a campaign or just a one-shot venture. After a long rambling beginning where he goes on about die integers and bell curves and shit like that, Gygax fleshes out the character classes, talks about followers and all that sort of thing, mentions hirelings and henchmen, goes on about some sort of spell explanations and just gives you a little bit more meat on the bones with spells and that. And thankfully, Gygax then starts talking about the adventures themselves. Talks about adventures in the air, adventures underwater, talks about adventures in the wilderness and all that sort of thing. And then he goes into how combat is performed, right? There are loads and loads of combat tables in there. It reads like a bit of a spreadsheet type thing. It's a bit of a mess, and yeah, Gygax then goes on about experience and leveling up. And then there is a first dungeon you can explore. He sort of goes into semi-detail about how the game's played and how the game is run. There's not really that much detail in how to actually play the game in this book. There are a few examples of how the game's played, like sort of fake characters like a DM asking players what they want to do, and then the players tell them what they want to do and all that. So even though it's not completely clear, there are sort of walkthrough examples on gameplay, and for a pre-internet dated book, it's all right. So really the rest of this book is taken up by different types of treasure that you may or may not encounter on your journey, and you'll be collecting treasure and trading it in for experience points. You will also be killing monsters to do that and all. So yeah, AD&D then became very, very popular. It spawned loads of supplements like the Wilderness Survival Guide, the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide, Oriental Adventures, and truckloads of other supplements and modules that you could buy, different to what's available now. You know, 5th edition D&D comes in these massive expensive books, but the first edition AD&D came in these tiny little wafer thin modules that they gave you, you know, sort of not a campaign, but just a few days worth of gameplay, and it was a lot cheaper and arguably better, right? So yeah, that's Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first edition. So what do we like about AD&D first edition? So the first thing that we really like about the first edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is the amount of content that was made available for this game. All you got to do is go over to Drive-Thru RPG and have a look and see how much stuff there was actually made for this. And like we said earlier, it wasn't the case that they produced 2 or 3 books a year. There was a huge amount of modules and accessories produced for first edition D&D throughout its sort of 12-13 year lifespan, and it's just something that we don't really sort of see much anymore. I mean, okay, there is third-party stuff made for 5th edition D&D, but I think it might be better if they maybe released a few smaller paperback books that you could just digest easy, rather than having these huge labyrinthine tomes that basically weigh the game down, you know. I really do like looking back and seeing the huge amount of content that was available. And obviously, where Gygax was sort of a pioneer in a sense, he laid the groundwork for all the adventures that came afterwards. And it's almost like the stuff that AD&D First Edition created has been recycled through the years, which had a bad thing, but there's something charming about the stuff that was created, especially like Tomb of Horrors, which was the first meat grinder module that was ever created, right? So yeah, huge amount of content for AD&D. So the second thing that we really like about first edition advanced D&D is that it stands in direct contrast to other fantasy settings that were around at the time, like J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. That had a monarchistic tone where you were looking up at the kings and queens of Middle-earth, seeing how they wielded power, and all the other plebs were just left to fight for them and perish and go to their doom, right? In D&D, it turned that on its head. It took the ordinary person, gave them the will to explore, and allowed them to progress and get better with experience. And this spoke to me as a kid, you know, so coming from a working class background, I didn't really connect with the Tolkien high fantasy. I was more interested in the down and dirty stuff that was at the bottom of the pile, you know, just ordinary people wanting to better themselves, going out and taking risks and trying to do better. Yeah, so that spoke to me more as a kid than the nonsense that was in Lord of the Rings, you know. So the third thing that we really like about AD&D is the fact that it is so rules light. This system gets criticised for being light on rules, but I really enjoy the fact that Gygax himself said that this system is more a set of guidelines than a set of rules. It also gets criticised for being unbalanced and sort of chaotic, yeah? But I quite like that. I like the fact that whilst it's fantasy, it taps into the psyche of real life, you know, the fact that real life isn't balanced, it's not fair. Most people's lives are made up of complete chaos. AD&D speaks to me in those sort of terms, you know. Even though you're playing a made-up character in a fantasy setting, you can sort of quite easily see yourself in that character, if you know what I mean. And yeah, I really like that about AD&D, right? So the final thing that we really like about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is that this system does not hold your hand. There is a real and present danger of death in this game. If you're a first level magic user, you're going to get 1 to 4 hit points, so you've got to be bloody careful at every turn. It's not like the later iterations of D&D and other role-playing games where your character is essentially some sort of souped up superhero even at level 1. In this game, you are just an ordinary person that has maybe a little bit of skill, but you are always staring death in the face. And when we played it, we didn't wrap ourselves out in cotton wool when we played this. We were very, very careful. We were always respectful of the game, yeah? So yeah, I like the fact that AD&D took a lot of risks back in the 80s, and I think that's what made it wildly popular. So what don't we like about AD&D first edition? So the first thing that we don't like about AD&D first edition is that it is pretty much an unorganised mess. It's very difficult to find what you want in the book when you need it, and that's something that the later editions of D&D have got down really well. Some of the rules are really confusing and convoluted, like say the rules for surprise and combat. It really is difficult to make any kind of sense at all about what Gygax was going on about. And I think somebody online has made a summary of the surprise and combat rules, and I think it goes up to like 20 pages, and even then it's still very confusing. And a lot of people back in the 70s and 80s house ruled the combat rules, and I don't think anyone played the combat rules as they were meant to be played, right? So yeah, bit of a mess. Organisation is pretty much non-existent, and some of the rules are head-scratchingly confusing. So the next thing that we don't like about AD&D is that the XP tables don't really make a lot of sense at all. Whilst we said we like the unbalanced nature of the game when you talk about XP tables, it takes less experience to advance from maybe second to third level than it does from first to second level. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So I remember reading an article online years and years ago where some bloke had actually gone back and rewritten all the experience tables, and I can remember distinctly him saying that the system that he revised works quite well. So it's almost like the original writers of D&D didn't really have much of a grasp on accounting. Yeah, so the XP tables, yeah, they're a little bit shit. So the next thing that we don't like about AD&D is that the monster manual, by today's standards, is a little bit thin on the ground. There's a lot of ordinary creatures in there, like worms and rats and stuff. And a lot of the entries are taken up by creatures that you're unlikely to encounter. There's a lot of space dedicated to dragons that you're probably not going to ever encounter, because you're probably going to die before you ever get to the level that you'll be able to have a scrap of them. There's the infamous demons and devils stuff that was taken out in the second edition. Probably never ever going to meet Beelzebub or Asmodeus, right? So it's a little bit of thin on the ground. I suppose we are looking at it from a perspective of today, but I suppose back in the day it wasn't really anything like this. And if you're coming into a fantasy RPG, the monster manual must have seemed fascinating at the time, but from our perspective now, looking back, it is a little bit feeble. So the final thing we don't like about AD&D is that it doesn't really tell you how to play the game. Especially the Dungeon Master's Guide, he starts waffling on about bell curves and integers and stuff like that, and I remember getting this as a 10-year-old thinking, what the fuck is he talking about? So as we said before, there is a few examples on how to play the game, but you're not really told step by step what to do. You had to know somebody who already knew how to play D&D back in the 80s in order to learn to play this, and we came to this from the red box D&D. We already knew how role-playing worked and how the D&D system worked, but if you came into this blind, it's going to be very, very confusing, very difficult to understand what the hell Gygax was talking about, especially if you are a kid, right? So to summarise, is AD&D still worth your time and bother today and in the future? So we're going to say yes, absolutely. This is by far and away my favourite role-playing system of all time. Well, maybe aside from the basic D&D, but then that's a case of nostalgia. I suppose this is a case of nostalgia as well. I prefer first edition AD&D over any other iteration of D&D. I've got everything to do with 5th edition D&D, but there's just something about 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons that doesn't really sit right with me. It's more like playing a cartoon character, and there's something outlandish about it. I know it's a fantasy role-playing game, yeah, but it doesn't have that grounded, dirty, rough feel that AD&D had back in the day, right? And that's something that I don't think Dungeons and Dragons is ever going to recapture. I love the fact that this rule set is so bare bones that you can basically put anything into it that you want. Gygax was very, very clear that this is just a set of guidelines, a skeleton system that you can use to create your own adventures. And it worked really, really well for the time. It was a bit of a disorganised mess, but once you got your head around the rules, once somebody else taught you how to play the game, that wasn't necessarily a problem. So yeah, do I recommend AD&D today? Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, don't worry about nostalgia. You know, if you want an easy to learn role-playing game that doesn't have a lot of bloat, isn't weighed down by the problems of the world today, then AD&D may just be the role-playing game for you. So there you go, that's AD&D first edition. Remember, if you're new in, please consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment in that section down below. I'll see you next Tuesday.